There is something deeply unsettling about waking up in the middle of the night and realizing the person sleeping beside you is gone. The first time it happened, I barely opened my eyes. I reached across the bed, expecting to feel my husband's warmth, but the sheets were cold. I assumed he had gone downstairs for a glass of water or couldn't sleep. I turned over, closed my eyes, and drifted back to sleep without giving it another thought. The second time, I noticed the clock. It was exactly 2 a.m. again. His side of the bed was empty. I listened carefully, expecting to hear footsteps somewhere in the house, but everything was silent. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open and close so softly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. When I woke up that morning, he was already making coffee as though nothing unusual had happened. I never asked where he had been at the time. It simply didn't seem important. If someone had told me then that those quiet disappearances would slowly unravel everything I believed about my marriage, I would have laughed. My husband and I had been married for almost 9 years. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but whose is? We had learned how to live around each other's flaws. We respected each other's routines, rarely argued about anything serious, and trusted one another completely. That trust wasn't something we talked about very often. It simply existed, quietly supporting everything we had built together. At least that's what I believed. Over the next several weeks, I kept waking up at the same time every night, 2 o'clock. It became almost mechanical. Sometimes I woke because I heard the bedroom door click shut. Sometimes I woke for no reason at all, only to discover the familiar emptiness beside me. Every single time he was gone, every single time he returned shortly before sunrise. At first, I searched for innocent explanations. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe he drove around to clear his mind. Maybe stress from work had become too much. Everyone copes differently. I reminded myself of that whenever my imagination started creating stories. Eventually, however, it became impossible to ignore another detail. He was changing, not dramatically, not overnight, just enough for someone who loved him to notice. He looked exhausted every morning. Even after spending hours away from home, dark circles slowly appeared beneath his eyes. He stopped laughing as easily. He spent longer staring into space, as though carrying thoughts he couldn't share. Even his smile seemed forced. Then his phone became part of the mystery. For years, neither of us had cared if the other picked up a phone to answer a message or check the weather. Suddenly, everything changed. Never left it unattended. He carried it from room to room. He turned the screen away whenever a notification appeared. He began charging it face down every night. I noticed all of it. I pretended not to. There is a strange loneliness that comes from watching someone you love become a stranger while still sharing the same home. You don't know whether you're witnessing a temporary struggle or the beginning of the end. I kept telling myself that trust meant giving him space. Unfortunately, silence creates room for imagination, and imagination rarely chooses the most comforting explanation. One Friday evening, He came home nearly 3 hours later than usual. His jacket smelled faintly of rain and old wood, not perfume, not alcohol, just something unfamiliar. He apologized for working late and looked genuinely tired. Normally, that would have been enough. Instead, I caught myself studying every movement he made, the way he avoided my eyes for just a second too long, the way he washed his hands immediately after coming home, the way he seemed relieved when I didn't ask questions. I hated the person I was becoming. I had never wanted to spy on my own husband, yet every unanswered question quietly pushed me closer to doing exactly that. A few days later, I accidentally woke before 2. The bedroom was dark except for the faint glow of the digital clock. 1:57. I stayed perfectly still. 3 minutes later, he slowly sat up. His movements were careful, almost practiced. He thought I was asleep. He reached for his clothes without turning on the light. He picked up his phone, his wallet, and his keys. Then he paused. For just a moment, he looked back toward the bed, toward me. I closed my eyes and forced myself not to move. Seconds later, I heard the bedroom door open, then the front door, then silence. This time I walked to the window. His car disappeared at the end of our street. I stood there for several minutes, wrapped in darkness, asking myself one question: where could someone possibly need to go every single night at exactly the same time? The next morning, I almost asked him. The words reached my lips. Then I stopped. Something inside me wanted the answer. Another part was terrified of he ring it. If he admitted he was seeing another woman, our marriage would never be the same again. As long as I remained silent, there was still hope that everything had an innocent explanation. Hope can be surprisingly addictive. Over the following week, I noticed even more changes. He started volunteering for extra shifts at work. He canceled dinner plans twice. He forgot my birthday lunch reservation for the first time since we'd been together. He apologized repeatedly, blaming exhaustion. I accepted the apology, but not the explanation. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found a receipt in the pocket of his jacket. It wasn't from a restaurant. It wasn't from a hotel. It was from a small neighborhood grocery store on the opposite side of the city. The receipt listed bottled water, soup, fresh fruit, bread, milk, medicine, and cleaning supplies. Nothing romantic, nothing suspicious. In fact, it made even less sense. Why would he drive nearly 40 minutes in the middle of the night just to buy groceries? The date on the receipt matched one of the nights he had disappeared. I stared at it for a long time. Instead of calming my fears, it made them worse. If he had been buying flowers or expensive gifts, I could have accepted the obvious explanation. Groceries suggested something else entirely. Someone who needed taking care of. That thought settled into my mind and refused to leave. A few evenings later, while he was taking a shower, his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. For the first time in our marriage, I considered looking at it. I stood there for nearly a minute, staring at the glowing screen. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. I reached toward the phone. Then I pulled my hand back. If I crossed that line, I knew I could never pretend our trust was intact again. I walked away. But the guilt didn't disappear, neither did the suspicion. The following Tuesday, I made a decision I never imagined I would make. The next time he left at 2 in the morning, I was going to follow him. The decision to follow my husband wasn't one I made out of anger. It came from exhaustion. There is only so long a person can live with unanswered questions before uncertainty becomes heavier than the truth itself. The next night, I set an alarm for 1:45 a.m. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the past several months, searching for the exact moment when everything between us had begun to change. I wondered if I had missed some obvious sign or ignored something important, because I wanted to believe our marriage was stronger than it actually was. When the alarm vibrated beneath my pillow, I was already awake. The house was silent. I waited. At exactly 2 o'clock, everything happened exactly as it had every other night. He quietly got dressed. He picked up his keys and phone. He slipped out of the bedroom. A minute later, I heard the front door close. This time, I didn't hesitate. Within seconds, I was in my own car, keeping enough distance that he wouldn't notice me. The roads were almost. He drove farther than I expected, past neighborhoods we rarely visited, entered one of the oldest parts of the city. Most of the houses there had been built decades earlier. Many needed repairs. Some stood completely empty behind overgrown fences. He finally turned onto a narrow residential street lined with aging maple trees. Then he stopped. The house looked worn, but not abandoned. Its paint had faded years ago. The porch leaned slightly to one side. Only one upstairs window was illuminated. Everything else remained dark. I parked almost half a block away from where I sat. I had a clear view of the front entrance. My husband climbed the steps, carrying 2 grocery bags, the same kinds of groceries I had seen on the receipt. Someone opened the front door. Before he even knocked, the light from inside spilled onto the porch for only a few seconds. I couldn't clearly see the person's face. I could only make out the silhouette. It appeared to be a woman. My stomach tightened immediately. He disappeared. Inside, the door closed. The upstairs light remained on. I stayed in my car for maybe I would catch them embracing through a window. Maybe I simply wanted undeniable proof that my fears were justified. Nothing happened. The house remained quiet. Just before dawn, the front door opened again. My husband walked back to his car carrying empty grocery bags. He looked exhausted. He rubbed his eyes before driving away. When I arrived home a few minutes later, I pretended to be asleep. He slipped into bed beside me without making a sound. His clothes smelled exactly the way they had several nights before. Rain, old wood, something faintly medicinal. I barely slept after that. Instead of giving me answers, following him had created even more questions. If another woman lived in that house, why did he stay for hours every night? Why only after 2 in the morning? Why bring groceries instead of flowers? Why leave looking completely drained? None of it fit the story I had spent weeks building in my mind. Still, I couldn't let go of the image of that silhouette opening the door. Over the next 10 days, I followed him for more times. Every visit looked almost identical. He always carried food. Sometimes he carried medication. Once he brought blankets. Another night he struggled with a folded wheelchair that barely fit into the trunk of his car. That surprised me. Affairs rarely involve medical equipment. Yet I still couldn't explain the woman. One evening I gathered enough courage to leave my car. After he entered the house, I quietly walked down the sidewalk until I reached the front gate. The yard was surprisingly well cared for. Someone had planted roses along the pathway. Wind chimes hung from the porch roof, gently moving in the night breeze. Nothing about the place felt secretive. It felt lonely. As I stood near the gate, I noticed something through the living room window. Not a romantic dinner, not candles, not laughter. My husband was kneeling beside an armchair. An elderly woman sat wrapped in a blanket. Her silver hair rested against her shoulders. She looked confused. One moment she seemed calm, the next, she appeared frightened. I watched my husband carefully place a bowl of soup onto a small table before helping her adjust the blanket around her legs. Shattered my assumptions. The elderly woman suddenly looked around the room with visible panic. She struggled to stand. She reached toward the front door, as though trying to escape her own home. Instead of stopping her forcefully, my husband calmly guided her back toward the chair. He remained beside her until she slowly relaxed again. There was no affection, quiet compassion. I stood frozen outside the window, confused, didn't even begin to describe how I felt. If this wasn't an affair, then why had he hidden everything from me? I returned to my car before anyone noticed me. The drive home felt endless. Every theory I had created over the previous month collapsed one after another. Yet one mystery remained. Who was she? And why did my husband believe he had to care for her completely alone? 3 nights later, woke up at 6 in the morning. His side of the bed was still empty. At first, I assumed he had simply stayed longer than usual. Then 7 o'clock came, then 8. His phone went straight to voicemail. He never ignored my calls, never. By 9, panic had completely replaced suspicion. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the old house. For the first time, I wasn't following him. I was desperately hoping I wasn't already too late. My hands were trembling so badly that I almost dropped my keys before I reached the front porch. Everything around the house looked exactly the same as it had every other night. The faded paint, the old rocking chair, the roses lining the walkway. The only difference was that it was daylight. For the first time, I could see the place clearly instead of through darkness and suspicion. I knocked several times. No one answered. The front door wasn't completely closed. It slowly opened as I pushed against it. I stepped inside, uncertain whether I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The house was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that makes every Floorboards sound too loud. The air carried the familiar scent I had noticed on my husband's clothes for weeks. Fresh coffee, old wood, laundry, detergent, medicine, everything suddenly made sense. There were framed photographs covering nearly every shelf. Most showed the same elderly woman at different stages of her life. She appeared in nursing uniforms, standing beside coworkers, smiling with patience, holding flowers after what looked like retirement celebrations. This wasn't the home of someone hiding from the world. It was the home of someone the world had quietly forgotten. Then I heard movement upstairs. Without thinking, I followed the sound. When I reached the second floor, I stopped in the hallway. The bedroom door stood partially open. Inside, I saw my husband asleep in a chair beside the bed. His head rested against the wall. He looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. Across from him lay the elderly woman. She was sleeping peacefully. An oxygen machine hummed softly beside the bed. Prescription bottles covered the nightstand. A calendar on the wall contained handwritten reminders for medication, meals, doctor's appointments, and emergency phone numbers. Everything about the room reflected months of constant care. My husband slowly opened his eyes. The surprise on his face lasted only a second. Then I saw something I hadn't expected. Relief, not fear, not guilt. Relief. It was as though he had been carrying an impossible weight for months and no longer had the strength to carry it alone. For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped searching for betrayal. I started searching for understanding. Over the next several hours, I finally learned the truth. More than 20 years earlier, before I had ever met him, my husband had been involved in a devastating car accident. His injuries were so severe that doctors weren't sure he would survive the night. The woman sleeping in that bed had been the emergency room nurse assigned to his care. She wasn't simply following hospital procedures. She stayed long after her shift ended. She noticed complications that others had overlooked. She pushed for additional testing that revealed internal bleeding just before it became fatal. According to the doctors who later treated him, those extra minutes had saved his life. He had never forgotten her. Years passed. Life moved on. He married me. We built our home together. Eventually, he assumed she had retired somewhere far away. Several months earlier, purely by coincidence, he had recognized her name in a local newspaper article, asking for volunteers to help elderly residents living alone. Curious, he looked into it. What he discovered broke his heart. She had no husband, no children, no close relatives living nearby. She had been diagnosed with dementia. As the disease progressed, the nights became terrifying for her. Almost every morning around 2 o'clock, she woke up confused and frightened. Sometimes she believed she was still working at the hospital. Sometimes she searched every room for parents who had died decades earlier. Sometimes she forgot she was inside her own home and desperately tried to leave. Professional caregivers visited during the day, but overnight assistance was limited, and she refused to move into a nursing facility. because the familiar surroundings helped preserve what little independence she still had. My husband couldn't walk away. He told himself he would help for a few nights. A few nights became a week. Week became months. He quietly adjusted his work schedule. He bought groceries, prepared meals, cleaned the house, made sure she took her medication, stayed beside her until the panic passed. Then he came home before sunrise every morning as though nothing had happened. At first, I couldn't understand why he had hidden all of this from me. Then I realized something painful. He hadn't been protecting a secret. He had been protecting me from a burden he believed belonged only to him. He felt that because she had once saved his life, repaying that kindness was his responsibility alone. He feared I would insist on professional care, donations, or outside help. He wanted to repay the debt personally. He never imagined that his silence would slowly destroy the trust between us. Standing in that quiet bedroom, I felt ashamed of every conclusion I had reached. For weeks, I had convinced myself another woman was stealing my husband. The truth was far more heartbreaking. He wasn't giving his love to someone else. He was giving his time to someone who had no one left. That realization changed something inside me. I also understood that kindness and secrecy cannot exist together forever. Even the purest intention becomes dangerous when it forces the people you love to question everything they know. Trust cannot survive in complete darkness. Over the following weeks, our lives changed, not because the elderly woman's condition suddenly improved. It didn't. Dementia continued to steal small pieces of her memories every day, but she no longer faced those nights alone. Began visiting with my husband. I cooked meals she enjoyed. I organized her medications. Sometimes we simply sat quietly while she slept peacefully in the chair near the window. There were evenings when she recognized my husband immediately. Other evenings she believed he was still a frightened young man recovering in a hospital bed. In a strange way, both memories were true. She had saved him once. Now he was trying to save her from facing the darkest hours of her life alone. Several months later, she passed away peacefully in her own home. She never knew how many lives she had touched. She probably never remembered the accident that had connected her to my husband decades earlier. But none of that mattered. Kindness doesn't lose its value simply because someone forgets it happened. Looking back now, I often think about how close I came to ending my marriage. Had collected imaginary evidence, built convincing theories, allowed fear to become stronger than communication. I wasn't wrong for noticing that something had changed. I wasn't wrong for asking questions. The mistake was believing that silence could only hide betrayal. Sometimes silence hides grief. Sometimes it hides sacrifice. Sometimes it hides an act of compassion so quiet that no one is ever supposed to know about it. If I learned anything from those long nights, it is this: the people we love are capable of carrying burdens we cannot even imagine. Sometimes the truth is exactly what we fear, and sometimes The truth restores your faith in humanity. When you least expect it, every now and then, I still wake up in the middle of the night. For a brief moment, I instinctively reach across the bed. Now, when I feel my husband's hand resting there beside mine, I smile, not because life became perfect, but because we finally learned that no act of kindness should ever have to live in the shadows. And no marriage can truly survive unless compassion and honesty walk side by side.